Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hey, it's Zoe, your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership expert. And I'm going to start off today with an announcement. We've got a special event coming up in May, on Friday, May 20th, here in Canberra, called Power Games, How to Deal with Team Tension. And if you've ever had team tension, this is the event for you. It's over lunch and it's free. And that's Friday, 20th of May. And you can register, and you better register quick because it's free and because it's a popular topic. I'm sure we're going to get booked out. And we're keeping the event nice and small so we can have really intimate conversations. So it's a lunchtime session, Friday, 20th of May here in Canberra. You can register for it at my website, zoerouth.com. Click on programs, click on events, and you'll find it right there. Okay, so on with today's show. It is a big topic. We are talking about sexual violence. We are talking about safety in the work environment and how to create safe cultures. So a little bit of a content warning up front because my guest, Tim, talks about his personal experience of sexual violence. And it is confronting and disturbing. So just a little warning for you if you're listening to this with children or somewhere in public, or you feel like this is not the story you want to listen to up front, then be warned. Okay, so having said that, that's a small part of the conversation. Then we go on to talk about masculinity and how it's changing and evolving and what we can do to really look at positive masculinity and be mindful of toxic masculinity. And then we move into talking about safety in the workplace. It's just a fabulous interview, and Tim is amazing. So let me tell you about my guest, Tim Mousseau. He is a survivor of sexual harassment, and he turned speaker and advocate. For the last 9 years, he's been working as a speaker and a researcher and working with organizations to create safer and healthier work cultures where people can thrive. Now, how do you do that? Well, we go into that in great detail in the interview. In his work, he has worked with over 400 companies, universities, and military installations worldwide, including congressional offices, professional sports teams, international franchises, and beyond. So he has been working with them to build safer cultures in all sense of the word. He is from fabulous New York, and I absolutely love this interview. So let's get on with the show. Woohoo! All the way from fantastic, fabulous New York. Welcome to the show, Tim Mousseau.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited and honored to be here.
There's so much good stuff I want to talk to you about and such important topics too. I always love to ask how people got to where they are right now. So a little bit of insight into your history in terms of now you're a speaker and so on. So how did you get to this point?
Well, I got my master's in organizational leadership. And initially, I was focused on curriculum design. And so I was doing work with colleges and universities in the United States focused on designing college courses for a lot of incoming students focused on soft skills, and particularly looking at peer mentoring. And as a result of that, I started presenting at a lot of conferences, and I just so happened to meet the president of a speaking agency. And, we sat down and had dinner a few times. And then after about 2 years, he was like, "Hey, you're really good at this. Have you thought about speaking full time?" And I had not. I didn't know that was a career when I was, in college. I don't think growing up that's something you were told you could do. And I really enjoyed that part of my job. And so I said, sure, I'll give it a chance. And initially, I was focused on just general leadership within the kind of higher education space. Pretty soon, though, I opened up about some of my own experiences as a survivor of sexual assault. I had just been writing and blogging at the time and had published a blog about what it was like to be a male survivor and got a lot of interest in that. And so all of a sudden, this blog kind of took off overnight. And my president said, "Hey, would you be interested in talking on that topic?" Spent some time thinking about it and kind of processing what that would be like, and then did start talking openly about that experience. So for about 8 years, focused mostly on sexual violence prevention and masculinity, speaking across the country, the United States with colleges. And then about 3 years ago, started to get asked by kind of companies and corporations of how can we adopt this to our workplace? What we found is a lot of companies didn't necessarily want to talk just about sexual harassment. They had to kind of formalize policies and training around that. But the kind of clear through line that came out was the idea of what does it mean to create a safe culture? And so that's a lot of the work that I do now is thinking about what does it mean to create a safe culture, one where individuals, employees, team members can bring themselves to work and speak up without fear of reprisal and know that they're going to be treated with respect. And so that's a lot of the work I do now, along with the research that I'm focused on.
Wow. And there's lots of burning questions in that really wonderful brief overview that you just had. So let's dig into it. So the first surprising thing that people's eyebrows are shooting up over is like, wow, a male victim of sexual violence and assault. What happened? Please feel free to share whatever you feel comfortable with. I wanted to know what your experience is in that whole incident and what came of it.
Yeah. So the assault in question actually took place when I was still in college, so around the ages of 19 to 20. And I say that because I actually didn't know at the time. I found out when I was 22 years old. I'd been working my first kind of real job and started to receive letters to my place of work. The letters were sent anonymously. In the beginning, they were just very degrading and derogatory. Talked about some personal things in my life and things from my college experience, and it was never okay, but I didn't necessarily know what to do or think, hey, there's really any need to be too concerned about this besides being upset with the contents.
Was this from somebody in a position of power and authority in the college?
I don't know. So I actually don't know.
Oh, anonymous.
Yeah, so it was sent completely anonymous. So like they would type out my name and contact information and send it to me anonymously. And eventually the letters escalated, and then kind of the final piece of them is I actually received photographs with pictures of me being sexually assaulted. And so that's how I found out about my assault. I have a lot of tattoos, and based on that fact, we know that it's definitely me in the photos. And based on my tattoos, we can tell that's when I was probably 19 to 20. I was completely unconscious in the photos, so I had no memory of this.
Wow.
And so that really changed so many aspects of, I think, the work that I was doing and what I was going through at the time. It really kind of opened the door to this trauma that I had no knowledge of. And then it further compounded because the job I was in, actually, it was a really toxic environment. And my boss, it was a small organization. My boss didn't create a good culture, but because the letters were coming to my place of work, I needed to call the police, and I had to tell him kind of why. And then he just used that to further harass me and kind of create a really dark, controlling dynamic of, look what I know about you, would tell me things like, you should make sure no one finds out about this because it'll stop your ability to get a job. And so that just kind of further compounded everything I was dealing with of facing this trauma of what had happened. And then on top of it, dealing with this toxic work environment.
Oh my God. So the original assault, was it in a hazing scenario, or you just have no idea?
No idea. I think it was just a sole predator who probably was somewhat related to, based on what they knew about me in the letters, someone who was in my communities or, was kind of tangentially associated with the friend groups I had in college, but really had no idea who he was.
So you suspect you were drugged in some way?
Yeah, drugged or potentially incapacitated with alcohol, just because, like I said, I had no memory of it, and my body was just essentially looked limp in the photographs.
Oh my God. And then to have it compounded in a workplace that was unsupportive is one word, but horrendous is another. Oh my God. So what kind of impact did this have on your mental health and self-esteem?
It was a very trying time, to put it lightly. I think that, there was about a 6-month period where it was very difficult and things were very dark. I was isolated. I kind of cut myself off from a lot of people because I really didn't know who to trust. And finally, after months of going through that, my mom just begged me to see a therapist because she was very worried about me and wanted me to talk to someone. And so I promised her I would. And that started to help. And then the therapist got me connected with other survivors, and that was extremely helpful in talking to people who kind of knew what I had gone through. And as soon as I could, I quit that job as well because I didn't really have a safety blanket. I, paid my way through college, had paid for my master's, and so I needed to just kind of gather some finances. And the second I could, I quit. And that's then when I got introduced to my speaking agency, which was kind of a blessing, and that it gave me that opportunity to move away from that really horrendous job.
Oh my goodness. When you started to talk about this incident, how was that for you? Because let's talk about one of the elephants in the room is that we don't often think of men as victims of sexual violence and sexual assault. And I'm projecting here and you can clarify for me, there is a stigma attached to that. Was that your experience or not?
Yes, absolutely. I think that it was really shocking in many ways. And that's why I actually ended up publishing about my experience and coming out about it, is because a lot of people, even people in my communities or friends or people I considered friends, were just not supportive, right? Some of the questions my boss first asked me when I told him why I was calling the police were things like, well, are you sure this isn't something you did that you're embarrassed of, or that you're doing to yourself for attention? Or then, like I said, he told me that I probably shouldn't tell anyone because I couldn't get a job. Or I talked to friends who, because I wouldn't show them the photographs, didn't know if they could believe me because that kind of stuff, they said, didn't happen to men. And I think there was this really profound disconnect of talking with people about, where is your empathy? I had something happen to me that I had no control in that I would really take away in a heartbeat. And why is it that you're so quick to blame me or ask me what I did wrong, or so many of those pieces? And that was really shocking. And I think a lot of survivors in general and male survivors go through that. I know that whenever I talk to any audience, regardless of who they are or the demographics involved, I hear from countless survivors, and I hear from a lot of male survivors, a lot of which share, like, I've never told anyone this, I've never met another male survivor, I've never disclosed this to anyone. And I think a lot of it is because of the shame that is put upon all individuals who experience sexual violence. But yeah, there is that stigma for men. Many times it comes to how we're socialized and things we're taught growing up. And, many of those beliefs, if you should be strong and a protector, how could this happen? Or, a lot of men are taught that their worth is tied to sex sometimes. And so then that kind of changes how people look at you in that capacity. And so that stigma definitely exists.
How did your interactions with female survivors of sexual assault, what was their response to your story and your sharing?
I still find it to be overwhelmingly positive. Being a survivor, I think of, regardless of your background, I think there's some of that shared commonality of, even if our stories are different or our experiences are different, you still have a little bit of an understanding of what it's like to face that trauma and harm. And so I would say across the board, survivors I've interacted with have always been very just gracious of the opportunity to talk. I think one thing I learned very quickly in my speaking career is for a lot of survivors I was interacting with, it wasn't even a matter of like coming for help or advice. A lot of people just wanted to tell somebody. And I think that is really the hard part of it, is that so often with my audiences, I had people just tell me, look, like, I just haven't told anyone this, because there's that fear of, I don't know who to talk to. I don't know how to talk about it. I'm afraid of how people are going to respond. And I think that ability to talk to another survivor removes some of that stigma, because it just feels like, hey, this is safer, and that I can tell you and you're going to understand, and I don't need help. I just need to talk.
So somehow you managed, with some support and therapy and getting out of that horrible workplace, to make something constructive of this, which is your work around culture and talking about masculinity. Let's start with the masculinity piece, because I'm really interested in what you have to say and in the research and thinking that you've done around contemporary masculinity. What is it? What's the status of contemporary masculinity? What are your thoughts on it?
Masculinity is evolving. I think that it's something I started to study because it's oftentimes so intrinsically tied into sexual violence. We know that obviously men can experience sexual violence. I'm a prime example of that. But we also know that, statistically, depending on the country and region, more often than not, the prime perpetrators of sexual violence are men, regardless of the gender of the survivor. And so I think that when I was breaking down why is this occurring, why is this happening, I started to study, well, how is this showing up in masculinity and masculine environments? It's not my research, but we do know that generally kind of traditional concepts of masculinity, so some of the ones I shared, like your worth is defined by how much sex you're having, or you have to be strong and stoic and not show your emotions, or you have to be the sole protector. Many of those traditional values are oftentimes actually equated with a higher propensity to engage in sexual violence or be complicit in sexual violence. And I think the reason I say that I feel like contemporary masculinity is changing is it's a pretty new field. We didn't actually start studying masculinity until like the 1970s. Up until that point, a lot of researchers on the topic just said, oh, well, all men think this way and this is just what we know. And so there wasn't a lot of critique of what it meant to be a man. Now, because of that, if we look at this is still a relatively new concept, I think over the last few decades, we've started to realize, hey, there's some of these things that we're taught that aren't really working and aren't really serving us. And that's where it becomes a little difficult, because I think so many men have these very profound values that they've been taught in their life. And the thing I always try and say to them, it's not saying your values are wrong or bad. It's the impact of those. So how are they impacting both yourself and others? And it's also the rigidity of it. I think whenever we look at masculinity from a very rigid angle of this is what it means to be a man in our community, in our society, and you have to fit these definitions, that lack of flexibility can be very damaging, because then we start to cast people who don't fit those definitions as others. And oftentimes there's that kind of ostracization of those communities and populations. And then even more so, I think if we only teach masculinity from this rigid perception, I think it really becomes harmful if you need to act outside of that, or if your personal values go against those rigid ideas. I do think over the last few decades, especially, over the last 20 years or so, we're seeing some shifts away from some of that rigidity. I think we're starting to see some of those pushes towards, let's look at the systems we've inherited, because they truly were given to us. We didn't create these, and let's start to critique whether these are working or not. I talk about it a lot, that example of men don't show emotions. We actually have plenty of research that shows men do show emotions, and men do feel them just as much. And it's okay and it's healthy. And I think for a long time that was something that was taught to many men, is don't show your emotions. That's not manly. And we're kind of looking at it and saying, well, actually, that's not true. That's not helping us either. And so I do think we're starting to see a little bit of that pushback of, well, what's working, what's not working, and how can we change that?
And on that note, like moving into a new picture of masculinity, what have you fleshed out? What is your picture? Have you got one?
I think the model I always like to talk about is what I just call healthy versus harmful. It's trying to work with both individual and group values. And it's really focusing on that idea of, is this hurting the self or others, or is this helping the self and others? And talking about it through that lens of both self and others, right? I think that that's something that we sometimes miss in there. But the reason I use that idea of healthy versus harmful is because the thing I'll tell all my audience is no one masculine value is good or bad, right? A thing I use a lot of times is, I work with professional sports teams and I talk with them, like valuing physical strength is something you need for your job. Being competitive and aggressive when you're playing is also something you need. I'm not telling you that's good or bad. It's how you're enacting that, in whether you're using it in a competitive sense because you're playing, but then are you also looking at how those values are showing up in your day-to-day interactions in your life? Are you looking at what that's like for impacting potentially your partners or your families or the community when you're not playing, right? Or you're not using those skills? Or, if you look at that value of strength, what does that mean, right? Because again, that's part of their job and that's something they need. But if it's to the point that you can never show any weakness, well, then maybe you're not actually taking care of your body as you would need to. Or maybe you're pushing yourself too far to meet these kind of boundaries around you. Or maybe you're putting yourself in pressure when you shouldn't be. And because of that, if you're always valuing strength and you're not willing to be a little kind of critical of it, that can also then go to mental health, right? If you say, well, my body is strong, you might falsely conflate that with my mind is strong and my spirit's strong. And so I was trying to get men to look at it from that, kind of looking on the dichotomy as opposed to either a clear black or white answer.
Have you got models in mind for, like, I'm talking examples, like human examples or archetype examples of a great way to look at the balancing of strengths?
I think whenever I break down strength, especially, I always try and look at it as, if we're looking at the individual benefit, the need to feel like a protector or to feel healthy in your body is good, and that's not bad. When we start to look at the fact that a lot of men experience body dysmorphia, that's where I would start to say, okay, that's where it becomes dangerous. If you're looking at yourself and comparing yourself to an action movie star and saying, I should look like that, well, those people are really living a life where that's all they do. They're professional trainers who come in and say, this is your eating habits and this is your schedule and you're working out 4 times a day to have 6% body fat and look like this, right? And so it's taking that healthy versus harmful model and putting the value upon it and kind of weighing it and saying, here's some good of what can come and here's some bad, right? Or that protector idea. Am I saying it's bad for men to feel like they should be a protector of their loved ones or family? No, not at all. But if that's leading you to bursts of anger, certainly. Or if you're not also valuing what your partner's capable of or your family's capable of, or if you're looking at on rigid gender lines of only men can be protectors, again, that's where it starts to enter into that negative territory.
Okay. So I'm just thinking, I want to check my thinking against yours. I'm I've done some work and research around archetypes and read some fabulous books around male archetypes in particular, and you're likely familiar with that work. So I think what I'm hearing you say is, for example, the warrior archetype, aka the protector, there is a really healthy manifestation of that. And the work that I've been reading, there's also the shadow side of that, which, from warrior into bully and so on. Is that how you're kind of looking at this healthy versus harmful versions of these values?
Absolutely. Right. I think the use of archetype, shadow side is a great way of putting it, right? When we look at values in action and we look at the behaviors behind them, anytime they can skew one way or the other, right? And there's always a propensity for that.
Okay. So let's look at the work that you've done since around building safe cultures where there's a sense of belonging. And those two things are correlated, but not necessarily always the same. Let's start. How do you do that? How do you build a culture that is safe for people?
A large part of it comes down to thinking about boundaries. And that's what a lot of my current research focuses on. I took a lot of the research I was doing in consent to think about how we're creating romantic or sexual relationships with partners and said, well, what are the core components of that? And one of the things I found is that every one of us has personal safety boundaries. We all have needs of how we like to be treated. We have wants and preferences. And these can be sometimes they're communal. So we say, look, if we know across society we've adopted, we're not going to discriminate in the workplace, or we're not going to have harassment here, right? And that's why you hear about companies where there's extreme cases of sexual harassment and everyone's kind of mortified and it makes the headlines, where a majority of companies say, to our best interest and our knowledge, we're never going to allow that here. So we have this kind of community boundaries. But then every one of us has very personal niche boundaries, boundaries that sometimes are common. Maybe it's, I like to receive feedback in person versus over email. So as much as possible, please, if you have feedback for me, tell me, in person. Or if we're in conflict, I need time to cool down before we have that conversation. So if something happens, please don't call me out on the spot. And then they can become very nuanced, right? One of my personal boundaries I oftentimes share with audiences is I hate nicknames, especially when they're given to me by individuals who have power over me. So in the past, when I used to work in jobs, this was my bosses and managers. Now it's even just clients who might have a power dynamic. The reason for that is because that toxic boss that I talked about at the beginning use nicknames in the workplace to kind of perpetuate that toxic culture. And he would call us demeaning nicknames in front of our clients and our peers that he knew, kind of targeted personal insecurities. And so for me, nicknames, if you give me a nickname, it causes me to kind of clam up and automatically become defensive. And so now that I know that's my boundary, the thing that I can do is I can figure out, do I need to share that with people? Or can I look at the context of the moment and say, hey, I can understand this person's doing it in a friendly way. Maybe this is part of their culture or something they're doing socially. Another example I have is I worked with an account manager once who, growing up, was from a family that expected her to be a high performer. And she always remembered whenever it was time for like any kind of practice or things like that, her mom would time her. And if she was doing wrong, her mom would tap on her watch as a way of kind of like indicating you're running out of time, you haven't finished your achievement, whatever it is. Well, translate to years later in the workplace, she had a boss that would come in when they were talking about projects and would tap their foot. And she said, just the sound of that tapping made me so anxious and it made me just want to shut down. And that's why I think bringing in this idea of boundaries into the workplace is important, because all of us have these. But my research shows we're not always great at sharing them. A lot of times employees are actually afraid of sharing their boundaries because they're fearful that managers or leadership might use them against them or use them adversely in promotion or, hiring, compensation decisions, things of that nature. But even if we're not talking about these boundaries, we can still feel a sense of violation around them. And so my goal is to say, hey, let's look at our cultures and let's look at how we're talking about boundaries. Where are we incorporating this into the process? When are we bringing this up? How are we creating a space where people are comfortable sharing it? And then also, how do we know how to navigate it? Like I said, a common boundary is oftentimes around feedback. We all have kind of preferences of what we want. Well, not all the time is that going to be able to be upheld. That's okay as long as we've had that conversation. Because if I've told you I really don't like feedback over email, and that, you might be able to send me an email saying, hey, I'm really sorry. I wish I could give you this in person. I needed to get this in front of you right now. And just even that language and that simple inclusion of, I know this is your boundary, I'm sorry, it makes me feel safer. And it builds that trust, because then I can say, this person cares about me. It's the circumstances at the time. They don't want to do this, but I know that their best intention is still for me to feel comfortable.
I love this concept. And for me, it points to the need for essentially team ground rules. which includes those ideas of boundaries. Sometimes I talk about it with my teams around the idea of pet peeves, and that kind of puts it, I don't know. I'll have to think about my language use around that, because I think boundaries puts in a really strong importance to it, as a pet peeve sounds a little bit petty. But it's not petty, right? It can feel petty until you share it. And I think what's important about the story you told, the nicknames thing, right? So somebody who gives others nicknames, in Australia, it's rife. Australians give each other nicknames all the time, usually in the form of shortening your name or lengthening it if you have a short name. So Tim would be Timbo or some version of that. And the intention behind it is familiarity and comfort. And yet, if it irritates someone, then it's important to surface that. I always check with new clients, let's say their name is Melinda. And I said, Melinda, do you prefer Melinda or Mel or whatever? And I've been surprised on a few occasions where it's Melinda. Do not shorten my name. And that you can tell in the vibe that it's something that pokes at them. So when you have talks about people with boundaries, is there any pushback or any inquiry about that sounds just really petty?
Occasionally. And the way I always try and talk about it is, I think the idea of safety is such a large term. And if we talk about trauma and harm and toxic cultures, people are like, well, that's not us. And those words feel very overwhelming. And so that's why I try and pull from a series of examples of things that feel relevant to anyone, because sometimes the pushback I get is, well, I was raised in a culture where you don't care and you just got to, toughen up and get over it because it's work and we're not your friends and things like that. And so I definitely hear that a lot. And my perception is a few things. First, really, if you know someone's boundaries, it's going to make your working relationship much smoother and better. And it really costs you nothing. It takes so little to actually learn what people's boundaries are and to share them. The second thing I always try and emphasize is that it is such a varied reactions of responses. I pulled this from a lot of my research around sexual violence prevention. More often than not, when I was talking about violence prevention, people thought of the most toxic behaviors, and that's what they thought they had to stop. And similar to boundaries, we need to stop discrimination and harassment, but minor violations of our boundaries wear on us over time. We have pretty clear data that they impact our decisions around retention and whether or not we stay in an organization, whether we're comfortable speaking up, how productive we are, whether we're able to making more creative decisions. And so there's all this research around why it's important to value them. And from there, it's just trying to help people recognize and use exercises to help them realize you have boundaries too. So for example, one thing I oftentimes hear is that generational divide of, I was doing a training once with a water treatment company. And one of the guys had been there for 25 years, was kind of one of their top sale managers. And the entire time he was like, I don't know why I have to be in this training. I'm comfortable with whatever. If I have a problem, I just get over it and I deal with it. And when I started to talk to him individually, what we realized is he was actually really anxious about the fact that his company kept adopting technology that made him feel outdated. And he had a lot of insecurity about, is my job going to be replaced by technology? And so I think some of the terms I'll use when I talk about boundaries is, anxiety or discomfort or mistrust, and trying to get people to think about what is a boundary that you hold that's very personal to you. And let's explore that, because I think when we can start to realize and use the right terminology around it, it becomes easier to recognize, oh, yeah, I do feel uncomfortable if someone does that. I wonder how they might be feeling. I think the first part of all my programs is to get people to actually acknowledge what their boundaries are. Because once we can come to the place of, look, this sucks, feeling that sense of discomfort is not fun. Sitting in a car on the way home from work and spending 30 minutes ruminating about a conversation you have with a boss because you don't like the way they talk to you. We've all gone through it and it's all bad. So what if there was a way to overcome that? Having that coworker that we avoid working with on projects because we just really can't stand the way they talk to us or the way they treat us in front of clients or whatever it might be. We've all been there, and I think that the way I try and make it more approachable is sometimes this is really stuff that stays with you and can influence your decisions. But more often than not, it's the little things that we really don't enjoy that the solution is really easy. Just being able to talk with each other and trust each other to say, hey, I prefer this over that, or I need you to do this as opposed to that, or, that's an easy way to talk about it. And it becomes much more approachable. But again, everyone has these. And so once we can recognize and agree that we all have some version of this, then we need to start incorporating it into how we treat each other. And we're building into team building and onboarding and hiring and all these aspects.
I think that's incredibly valuable. And I think little prompters like the one that you mentioned earlier, which is, how do you like your feedback? I think is pretty essential. Have you got any other little prompters like that leaders can apply if they want to start having these conversations?
Yeah, I would say one of the best times I always recommend incorporating boundaries is into the onboarding process. And I think that another thing I would recommend, and I know this isn't a prompt yet, but is always starting by modeling the way, right? A term we're very much familiar with leadership, but thinking about it in the capacity of the best way to ask someone for their boundaries is to model your boundaries, especially if you don't know them and trust hasn't formed yet. So to say, hey, on our team, we prefer not to, have conflict in front of clients. So what that means for us is if we're in a group meeting with a client and you recognize that someone messed up, our team prefers that you wait until we get back to the office or we're off the call or whatever before we talk about it. And we intentionally spend 10 minutes at a time talking about those things. Or, hey, I always tell my employees or my team members that if they want to bring me feedback, the best way to do that is to send me a formalized email first, because that way I know what we're doing and I can come mentally prepared for that conversation. I'm not distracted by other things. Things you can ask are, how do you like to be communicated with outside of work? Do you have any considerations there? Hey, are there any things that you really don't like to talk about in the workplace? Are there topics that you don't feel comfortable sharing about? And what are those? Thinking about if conflict arises, can you tell me a time when, someone handled that well for you? What did that look like? What solutions did they implement? What tools did they use to help you overcome that conflict? Great, fantastic. I will try and do that if we have any kind of situations like that coming up.
Those are really good little prompters. I think this is also timely as a lot of teams are trying to work out still, even 2 years into a pandemic, what's working, what's not working when it comes to hybrid environments, like all of a sudden we're discovering little pet peeves or boundaries around working with each other virtually. And I think it's really timely that leaders have conversations about that. What's working and not working in terms of when you like to be contacted or when we have video conferencing, what are your preferences? What gets on your nerves there? An example could be, is it, cameras on or cameras off? And what are our expectations of that? I was reading one book that said if it's, all cameras on or all cameras off, you don't have a blend. And I think that was an interesting call, because some people can't have their cameras on because maybe their computer isn't working, their computer camera, or they're in a disaster zone because the only place they can do their video conference is in the middle of the kids' playroom. And it doesn't feel very professional. Have you got any suggestions for people who are trying to navigate hybrid virtual team environments on this topic of boundaries?
To your point, I think one of the first things I always recommend is talk about communication. I think when people are comfortable and okay communicating, and also what different channels to use communication, right? Because I know some people are using Slack, or they're texting, or they're emailing, or they're calling, or they're doing virtual calls. And so I think it's good to just sit down and say, like, hey, what is your preference for different types of communication? If I need to communicate X to you, I'm going to use this tool, or if I need to communicate Y to you, I'm going to use this tool. I think another huge thing is to talk with your team members about what their preferred work schedules look like, because I really do appreciate when we trust our employees to know what's best for them. And I think that's really great. I think that really, if you're trusting people and you care about what they need, I think you can be a little more flexible. I'm not a morning person. I know that about myself. I don't function well until really about 11 a.m. And so because I work for myself, I can schedule intentionally my day to say, hey, here's certain things I'm doing before that time, and saying, like, I block off my calendar so that if someone wants to book a meeting with me, I don't have 8 a.m. slots open. Now, absolutely, if I have a client that needs to, 100%, I can be flexible. But for my best self, it's good to know that about me. And if we can talk to our people and say, what would an ideal schedule look like for you? And are there ways we can be more flexible? And are there times that really work? I think respecting people's calendar time as well, asking and sharing with your teams, look, if you want some time to just work on projects and not be interrupted, either let us know. Is that a daily time you're looking for? Is that something you need to put on your calendar? How can we make that happen, right? Some people are really good at flitting between projects and moving back and forth between meetings and their work. Other people really want to say, look, I want a 3-hour chunk to do my work, and then I'm okay doing meetings, right? And so I think talking about what do calendar preferences look like, and how can we respect those? How can we be mindful of those? How can we set them up to give people some of that opportunity to do their best work in a way that really works for them, and is going to, an end result is they're going to be more productive.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's incredibly helpful. I want to ask you about your work and thinking around belonging. So safety and belonging are correlated, as I mentioned earlier. How do you see them interconnected, and how do we create a sense of belonging?
For me, you cannot ask people to feel comfortable belonging if they don't feel safe. If I do not trust you, then I'm not going to share things with you. And I think that is a topic that I call trust gaps, and I talk quite a bit about, is that if I feel like you have intentionally ignored my boundaries after I've told them to you, or if I feel like anytime I try and speak up, your reaction is averse and negative, then usually what happens is people just stop speaking up. And they stop sharing their opinions, they stop talking openly, they stop sharing their feedback or their concerns, because either you have told me, hey, I shared this with you and you just ignored it, or your reaction was so averse and so it was really hard to have this conversation with you. And so more often than not, the human response is, well, I'm just not going to put myself in that circumstance. Well, from there, the end result is, if we don't feel like we can bring our opinions, and if tied to that, if we can't be ourselves, why do we want to stick around? It's not that I need everyone I'm working with to know every single part of my life, but I also do need you to have some kind of understanding of who I am, some kind of understanding of what's important to me. And I need you to be somewhat respectful of that within, the limits of professionalism, right? And so I think the more that we can focus on this idea of, hey, it's okay to have divergent opinions. It's okay to know that these aspects of your history and who you are and your culture and your identity are going to impact your work. We can never separate ourselves, our work selves, from our personal self. And I don't think we should, because I think that oftentimes is our greatest asset. But if your implicit actions and behaviors are showing me that you are devaluing those pieces, then I'm just going to slowly check out and I'm going to stop speaking up. I'm probably not going to take on more opportunities. I'm going to feel a disconnect from the work. I'm probably going to spend time wondering why I'm here or what I'm doing. As an end result of that, eventually I'm going to leave. And so I think when we can really pause and say, how do you like to be treated? And what do you need as a person? It just gives that small sense of, wow, these people care about me. And regardless of the work I'm doing, at least my identities aren't being dismissed and my concerns aren't being dismissed.
I love that. So I think that's a great observation. Safety is a precursor to belonging. What do you think about creating a sense of tribe, of identity with the team? Have you done any work around that? And do you see any concerns around it?
Yes. So I would say that's kind of the last step I always talk about, is how do we make sure that this stuff sticks? Because I think it's easy in a lot of my sessions to have conversations of, hey, what do you need? What do I need? What are our boundaries? What language are we using? How are we talking about this? But for me, if the culture doesn't back it up, if the community doesn't back it up, and if the policies don't back it up, then it's not going to stick. And so I think part of it is being willing to interrogate those pieces and say, what systems do we have in place that aren't working? What does it look like for us as a group? Are there certain things that we need to define are a piece of our organization, right? So I know every industry and many times many companies and even teams within those companies have their own unique cultures. We need to be aware of that, because that's going to change how we're hiring people. That's going to change how we're welcoming people. And that's going to change those ideas of communal boundaries. If your industry is traditionally a fast-paced, cutthroat type of industry, I'm not going to tell you those values are bad. Maybe that's what you need. And maybe that's the work you need to do. But how are you sharing that openly? And how are you looking at what those values look like in action and the policies around them? And, how are you communicating that to potential hires or to employees? And then also, what is your willingness to potentially, like I said, interrogate those things? Because just as we talked about with archetypes and the shadow self, being, fast-paced and, really focused on numbers is not bad. The way that you're holding people accountable to that, are you using shame? Well, that's not productive, and that's always going to fail. Are you looking at the actual values in action then? Because if those values and actions start to come out of alignment, that's where I think a lot of that danger comes. And that's where power becomes a huge factor of it. I think that if we lift any one value or any one person or set of people above the rest and say, well, we can't touch this person because they're our charismatic leader, or this is the way things have always been done, and if you don't understand it, that's just because you're not a fit here. I think anytime we speak in those kind of absolutes of this iconoclast idea of what it means to, this is a part of us, that's where I get really nervous. Because for me, what you're saying is we're not willing to change and we're not willing to take outside feedback. And I think that's where leaders talk about, like, well, why aren't we getting, diverse hires, or why are people outside of this set pool not wanting to join our teams? And I say, well, look at look at the culture you're building and look at how you're communicating that. Because I think no one part of culture, no one policy, no one practice is so perfect that it can't be explored.
It comes back a little bit to what you were saying in the beginning around values and the healthy versus harmful expression of it. And I think the same could be said of as the collective set of values, which is expressed in the culture. What's the healthy versus harmful version of that? We need to be mindful of the shadow side of what we espouse to be. So that's really awesome and helpful insight. So what resources can you recommend to people, books or podcasts?
I would say one good one around masculinity is called The Descent of Man by Grayson Perry. It's one of my favorites. I really enjoy it, especially if you haven't had a lot of conversations around masculinity. It's kind of a very high-level primer that I think does a really good job of starting to communicate some of the concepts of masculinity really well.
You called it the Descent of Man by Grayson Perry?
Yep.
Did I get? Okay, great.
So that's a really good book on masculinity.
And have you got a book out as well?
I do not. I do publish blogs regularly on my website, though, and actually just rolled out one of my more recent research reports. So I did a survey with 83 managers and 379 of their direct reports, and actually put out about a 15-page report breaking down like how they're defining boundaries, how boundaries impact turnover, how they define cultures where people feel safe, why or why not they share their boundaries. So that's on my website. You can either look at my blog or just download the report from there. And
what is the name of your website, Tim?
Yeah, it is timmousseau.com. So just first and last name.
Okay, Mousseau spelled Mousseau.
Yes, yeah.
Haha, very French.
Yes, yeah.
Fantastic. Tim, this was really amazing. I'm so thankful for the work that you're doing out there. I've loved this conversation. There's so much more to explore with this. And such important topics that we need to gently encourage our leaders and teams to actually start talking to each other about this stuff, because life is so much better when we feel safe to communicate and connect, and in a way that serves each other and is respectful of one another. So thank you so much again, Tim.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me.
That was really fantastic. I could definitely talk to Tim for much longer than the time that we had at the interview. And indeed, we did talk some more after we clicked end record there about different resources around masculinity and so on. My key takeaways for this interview, I think, one is around rearticulating healthy versus harmful when it comes to masculinity or when it comes to cultures in general. There's always a shadow side of what we intend. I think we need to be really mindful of that. And we can take a strength and overuse it, and that can turn into a shadow. So being mindful of that in context of culture and masculinity is really fantastic. In terms of team tips, this is what I've taken from the conversation, is to have a conversation with the people that you work with in your team around your boundaries or expectations or preferences. I think any one of those words will apply to this work, and it's about helping each other work best and be our best. A couple of things that you can talk to people about and clarify with them are, as Tim mentioned, our communication channels. How do you want to be communicated with? Do you like Slack? Is it a text? Is it a phone call? Is it an email? And do you use different channels for different types of messaging? I think the next thing he talked about is work hours. Like especially if you're in a hybrid virtual environment, what can work for each of you as well as the organization in terms of when can you expect me to be available, and when do I need to be flexible, and does that work? So it's a bit of conversation about what's ideal and what can work for the team and for the organization and for you. The third question would be, how do you like your feedback? How do you like it over the phone, immediate, or to be flagged ahead of time that you need to think about it, and that kind of stuff. So I think that's a really useful one. Next one is meeting time. So when's useful meeting times for you? When are you going to be at your best? And when do you need focus time? So I think that's something that we've implemented with our team too. It's like I let people know which are my focus days, which is when I'm doing client work or when I'm doing writing or when I'm doing a content production. And it really helps me when those are uninterrupted blocks of time so that I can get my best work done that day. And same with the team. There are times when they need to have times during the day when they need focus time because they're doing detailed work and they don't need me badgering them about this, that, or the other. And I love the idea that Tim touted also about your ideal work day. And let's share what that could look like. And sometimes we might be pie in the sky dreaming with that. And sometimes it's like, yeah, we can make all that work. And hopefully amongst your team, there is a good enough overlap so people can appreciate what's working, what's not working for them. And I'll toss in my own tip, and that's to talk about pet peeves, and it could be anything from, I really don't like the passive-aggressive notes in the bathroom. Or it really bothers me when people just leave their mugs on the counter instead of washing up after themselves. That kind of stuff also wears away at people, and it's something that I expounded quite extensively in the online module for amplifiers, which is talking about the 4 environments that are real tells for a culture, and we need to be mindful of them. So the welcome area that you have in your physical workspace, if you do have one, same thing actually applies to your website. What's the welcome area like on your website? What does it say about you? There's the art that you have on your walls, because everything has a message. And then there's the 2 that are interesting, is the kitchens/staff area. If you have one, that's also a tell if you do or you don't. And the bathroom area. So there's some places where you can go in your culture, which really you have to look at and see what's happening there. And is it expressing the values that you want to express in your workplace? All right, so plenty of food for thought here. I'd love to hear your take on any of it. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it, please rate and review the podcast. It makes a big difference. Increasing in ratings increases the visibility of the podcast and brings a bigger audience, which helps me get my work out into the world and also help leaders get access to these amazing interviews and insights. This show is brought to you by our flagship program, Amplifiers, which is an advanced leadership training program for CEOs, managing directors, and senior executives from across a multitude of different sectors. And we have opportunities for you to join wherever you are in Australia and around the world. And also, we have a local chapter based here in Canberra, and we gather once a quarter in person to go through a deep dive on one of the 4 main skills of leadership: leading change, leading performance, leading culture, and leading strategy. So if that's you and you're looking for something to step you up a little bit and give you more of an edge in your leadership and help you deliver bigger impact as well as bigger results, then check us out. Go to zoerouth.com, click on programs, click on amplifiers, and there's a bit of information there. Otherwise, you can email me, zoe@zoerouth.com. All right. That's probably enough for today. I really hope you are doing well and that you are thriving. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate your listenership, and I like to picture you walking or at the gym or driving and listening into this show and getting little pennies dropping in terms of insights and how it's going to make your leadership better. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.